The loch does not move. It waits. Beneath the shifting skin of mist and the breathless glass of the water, something vast, slow and unseen presses its face upward, never surfacing, only gazing. There are places in the world where the silence becomes so deep it begins to echo, where stillness is not peace, but a question, whispered again and again. Loch Ness is such a place. Long before the cameras, before the sonar, before the frayed tourist brochures promising glimpses of ancient giants, there was only the land and the water. The Highlands of Scotland, veined with dark rivers and glens where wind speaks in old tongues, cradled this long finger of black water, like a wound that never closed. The lake is ancient, carved by ice, deepened by time, and drowned in layers of story so thick no one remembers where truth ends and dream begins. They say Loch Ness is over 750 feet deep in places, its bottom hidden beneath centuries of sediment and secrecy. But its true depth cannot be measured in feet. It lies in the psychic terrain, in the chasm between what we know and what we fear. It is a loch where myths do not die. They wait, submerged, evolving with the needs of each generation, wearing new faces but carrying the same old ache, the desire to believe in something more. Before she was Nessie, she was nameless, a shape seen from the corner of an eye, a ripple with no wind, a darkness beneath a boat that was not a rock, not a fish, not anything known. The earliest legends did not call her a monster, but a water horse, a kelpie, seductive and treacherous, a creature that could take human form to lure the unsuspecting into drowning embrace. The locals did not speak of these things loudly. They were not stories for tourists or thrill seekers. They were warnings, etched into oral tradition, like runes on whetstone. In the 6th century, a Christian missionary named Columba is said to have encountered a beast in the River Ness. It attacked one of his followers, and Columba, raising his hand in the sign of the cross, banished it back into the depths. The hagiographies record it as a triumph of faith over pagan terror, a sign that the wild spirits of the Highlands would bow to the one true God. But the story left a shadow, a suggestion, that something was there before the cross was raised, something old, something primal, something not so easily tamed. The centuries passed. The world changed. Empires rose and fell. Steamships crossed the Atlantic. Cities grew fat and bright and busy. But in the north, in that dark stretch of Scottish earth, the loch remained the same, still, watchful, unspoiled by time. It became a mirror in which the modern world might glimpse its oldest fears. In the quiet, people began to see again. A hump, a long neck, a thing too large to be explained, too vague to be disproved. And then, in 1933, the silence broke. A local couple claimed to have seen something crossing the road near the loch, a creature large and lurching, slithering back into the water. Their story made the local paper, and from that single account, a tidal wave of sightings erupted. Reports flooded in, from school teachers, from fishermen, from clergymen and engineers. The loch had awakened, or rather something in the collective imagination had, and it was hungry. The following year, a photograph appeared, grainy, black and white, and instantly iconic. A long neck, an arched back, a creature straight out of a child's dream or nightmare. The surgeon's photo, they called it, and it became the genesis image of Nessie as the world would come to know her. It did not matter that it was vague, that it could have been anything. Its power lay in its ambiguity. It invited belief, and belief rushed in like water through a broken dam. For once a monster enters the frame, it refuses to leave. The eye searches for it. The mind, primed by centuries of tales and half-whispers, reshapes shadows into serpents, waves into coils, birds into scaled backs, gliding just beneath the surface. Loch Ness had been waiting for this moment. Or perhaps we had. The world in the early 20th century was fraying, frenzied by wars, by machines, by the loss of older certainties. Something was needed, something ancient, mysterious, unquantifiable, a mirror to our unease. And so Nessie emerged, not from the loch, but from the darkroom. The surgeon's photo, published in 1934, was more than an image. It was a relic, a visual invocation. The long neck, the ripples, the impossible size, it told a story without needing words. Suddenly, this was not just folklore. It was evidence. And that single photograph did what no sermon, no story, no centuries-old legend could. It gave the monster a face not seen clearly, but enough to haunt, enough to believe. The world responded with obsession. Expeditions were mounted. Scholars and soldiers came. The loch, once the quiet heart of a remote land, became a stage. Scientists lowered microphones into its depths. Journalists camped on its banks. Tourists flooded the roads, hoping for a glimpse, a blur, a confirmation. But the more we looked, the less we saw. The loch, vast and deep and dark, swallowed certainty, like it swallowed light. Nessie became not a creature, but a canvas. This was not the birth of a monster. It was the birth of a myth, rebranded. The people who came to the loch were not chasing a reptile. They were chasing a crack in the modern world's armor. For what is the Loch Ness monster if not a rebellion against rationality? A reminder that something might still lie beyond the reach of reason, lurking in places that maps can chart, but minds cannot grasp. In an age of encyclopedias and blueprints, Nessie was a resurrection of the unknowable. And the unknowable is always sacred. But the sacred invites scrutiny, and the scrutiny revealed shadows of its own. In time, the surgeon's photo began to unravel. Decades later, it was revealed as a hoax, a toy submarine affixed with a fabricated neck, floated and photographed with care. The doctor had lent his name, but not his hand. The real architect was a man fueled by revenge and theatrical flair. And yet, the exposure did not kill the legend. It could not. Because the photo was never the source of the myth. It was only the mask. Even as skepticism grew, sightings continued. Every ripple became a resurrection. A branch became a beast. A wave distorted by wind and angle and wishful thinking was declared a neck, a tail, a monstrous form. Scientists pointed to sturgeons, to standing waves, to the physics of long, narrow lakes. But the explanations were too clean, too mundane. And so the legend adapted, evolved, fed by paradox. For Nessie's greatest strength is her refusal to conform. She does not play by zoological rules. She is not caught, tagged, dissected. She is glimpsed, and only ever partially. A myth thrives in the space between clarity and confusion. And the loch, with its murky depths and ever-changing light, provides the perfect theater. No body is needed, only the possibility. The breathless second before doubt intervenes. And perhaps in this way, Nessie is more real than any fossil or scale or sonar ping could make her, because she is not bound to flesh. She lives in the collective unconscious, in the hush that falls when someone points to the water and says, "Did you see that?" She is the echo of our need to believe in mysteries unsolved, in shadows unclaimed, in waters that still hold secrets. She is the whisper beneath the wake, the question
no one can answer. And that is what makes her endure. Myths do not require answers, only echoes. They ask not to be solved, but to be heard again and again, until the asking becomes part of us.
Nessie is not a creature trapped in a lake. She is a riddle embedded in our psyche, a ripple across centuries of belief. Her presence is not validated by sightings, but by longing, by the ache for something vast, hidden, and untouched by modern hands. But even longing has architects. The 20th century did not just witness the evolution of Nessie, it shaped her. In the decades following the infamous photo, Loch Ness became the theater of an ongoing drama between faith and fact. New technologies were introduced: sonar, underwater cameras, submersibles, each promising to finally pull the curtain back, each failing. But the failures were not disappointments, they were rituals. Proof that the loch would not yield her secrets to machines. One of the most famous of these was Operation Deep Scan in 1987. A flotilla of boats, sonar equipment humming, swept across the loch in formation like a naval armada seeking a ghost. They found anomalies, readings they could not explain, and the headlines followed. Something is there, but they could not say what. And that was enough. Because Nessie thrives not on proof, but on the tension between the possible and the proven. Every failed expedition renews the spell. Every unanswered signal adds another verse to her song. It is no coincidence that Nessie became globally famous during the rise of mass media. She is a child of newspapers, radio, film. A myth reborn not in oral tradition, but in print, and yet echoing the shape of older stories. In this, she resembles the monsters of ancient lore, the sea serpents that haunted medieval maps, drawn curling at the edges of the known world with the warning, "Here be dragons." Loch Ness became one such edge, a pocket of the unknowable nestled within the overmapped. And yet, the loch itself is not just a setting. It is a character. Its geography invites myth. Long, narrow, over 20 miles in length, deeper than the North Sea in parts, and stained with peat so dense that visibility drops to near nothing, just feet below the surface. It is a body of water where things can vanish utterly, not just physically, but imaginatively. It holds memory like silt. It erases clarity with every passing hour of fog. It is a landscape built for half glimpses, for distortions, for things that almost but never quite come into view. This is where Nessie breathes, in the almost. And through the years, people have seen her in all forms: a dinosaur, a dragon, a long-necked amphibian, a displaced plesiosaur swimming through a crack in time. The creature changes with the culture. In times of scientific optimism, she is a relic, a living fossil. In times of fear, she becomes more monstrous, a threat to be spotted and feared. And in times of wonder, she is simply a mystery, an offering to the sacred unknown. What she is never allowed to be is solved, because a solved Nessie is a dead Nessie. The spell is in the silence. The wonder lives in the watching. And the moment she is dragged from the water, measured and explained, she ceases to be what we need her to be. She becomes a carcass, a footnote. And myths do not belong in laboratories. They belong in lochs, in whispers, in ripples that vanish before they are named. She swims not through water, but through time. Each era casts its own shadow onto her shape. The Nessie of the Cold War was a mystery wrapped in paranoia, a metaphor for hidden threats beneath calm surfaces. In the post-war boom, she became a symbol of escapism, a fantasy to cling to in a world growing sterile with certainty. During the digital age, when everything could be simulated, she slipped into the blur between fact and fiction. Her grainy silhouette passed endlessly through screens, an artifact of analog wonder in a pixel-perfect world. But not all transformations are accidents.
Some are constructed, deliberately, strategically. By the 1970s and 80s, Nessie had become more than a legend. She was an industry. Hotels sprang up on the loch's edge. Guided boat tours promised sightings. Souvenirs filled shelves, keychains, plush toys, postcards, each bearing the smiling image of a monster no one could prove. She had gone from spirit to spectacle. And yet, in becoming commercial, she did not diminish. She multiplied. Like water dividing around stones, the myth flowed into new channels: books for children, documentaries for late-night television, pseudo-scientific journals, and even government discussions. The British Natural History Museum once publicly challenged the notion of her existence, not because she was a threat, but because she was becoming too popular. The legend was interfering with science, and science does not like to be interrupted. But legends, like dreams, do not ask permission. It was during this period that a curious paradox emerged. The more skeptics tried to bury the myth, the deeper it seemed to root itself. Each debunking spawned new sightings. Each explanation bred new questions. Was Nessie a surviving plesiosaur, a misidentified seal, a line of swimming otters, a submerged log caught in a rare tidal vortex? The theories became their own labyrinth, and the more intricate they grew, the more the monster slipped through the cracks. Something strange began to happen. Nessie, once hunted, became protected, declared a vulnerable species by the Scottish government, given ecological status, wrapped in environmental policy. No one had proven she existed, but just in case, she should not be harmed. It was an act not of science, but of reverence, a recognition that some things are sacred even if, especially if, they cannot be seen. And this marked a shift. The monster once feared became a symbol of innocence, of lost mystery. Nessie became something to be wished for, not hunted. Children drew her with crayons, green and smiling, waves curling around her like lullabies. She moved from the realm of horror into the realm of hope, a remnant of a world that might still contain wonders too strange for logic and too beautiful to destroy. But deep beneath this gentle surface, a darker truth lingered, a truth not about the monster, but about us. For what does it say about a people who must invent mysteries to fill the silence, who conjure monsters not to flee from them, but to feel again the thrill of the unknown? Nessie's persistence is not proof of her reality. It is proof of our need, our desperate, aching need for secrets. In a world where satellites map every inch, where cameras watch every street, we long for a place where something might still hide. And Loch Ness, wrapped in mist, guarded by myth, becomes that sanctuary. It is not the monster we search for. It is the permission to believe. Because belief, in its purest form, is an act of rebellion. In a world that worships certainty, to believe in Nessie is to leave a light on in the room of the impossible. It is to insist that something may yet elude us, that the age of wonders has not ended, merely changed its disguise. We are not children anymore, but part of us still listens for footsteps in the attic of the world. And this attic, this dusty and echoing space where myth and memory overlap, is where Nessie lives most fully. Not in the water, not in the film reels, but in the hush between breaths when someone looks at the loch and wonders, she becomes a ritual, an initiation into mystery. Every tourist who stands at the water's edge, camera in hand, becomes part of the rite. Every skeptical sigh is another offering. The monster does not need to exist in the flesh. She exists in the waiting. But something began to shift, subtly, slowly, at the turn of the millennium. The internet arrived like a storm, flattening mysteries with facts, or simulations of facts.
Search engines became oracles. Satellite images stripped landscapes bare. And in that bright, buzzing world of always-on answers, Loch Ness became harder to hear. The silence that once whispered began to thin. The noise grew louder. And Nessie, the ancient shadow, seemed to flicker. Yet the paradox deepened. For the very tools that threatened to debunk her became tools that kept her alive. Online forums filled with sightings, theories, blurry video stills dissected frame by frame. Amateurs became investigators. Children became archivists. The monster migrated from water to web. She became digital folklore, passed not through fireside tales but through code. Her body was no longer in the loch. It was in the collective scroll of a million curious fingers. And then something even stranger happened. Scientists returned, with drones, with infrared, with DNA testing of the water itself, a method called environmental DNA, capable of cataloging every organism living in the lake by the traces it left behind. When the results came back, there were no signs of prehistoric reptiles, no dragons, but the tests revealed something mundane, an overwhelming presence of eel DNA. Eels, slippery, ancient, misunderstood. Could Nessie be a giant eel, magnified by imagination? The researchers hesitated to claim it, but the headlines pounced. "Nessie may be a super eel," they screamed. It was almost tragic. The world, desperate to keep the mystery, but unwilling to admit it, grasping at science like a lifeline, and a noose at once. But the loch does not care what science says. It does not yield to certainty. The same way it swallows light, it swallows conclusions. For every theory, another shadow forms. For every answer, a deeper question opens. And somewhere in the fog, Nessie continues, not defeated, not disproven, but transfigured once again. She slips between categories. She becomes not a creature, but a process, a ritual of doubt, a sacrament of wonder.
That is why she persists, long after her photograph was unmasked, long after the sonar pings fell silent. She is not a hoax to be exposed. She is a mirror, held to our restless yearning. And what she reflects is not a creature, but a hunger, the deep, unquenchable thirst to stand before something vaster than ourselves. We do not truly seek a monster in the water. We seek a rupture in the fabric of certainty, a tear in the veil, something that whispers, even now, not everything has been named. In this age of satellites and algorithms, that whisper is salvation. But mirrors do more than reflect. They distort, they invert, they make us see what we carry within. And if Nessie is a mirror, then the shapes we find in her myth are not just relics of the past. They are projections of our own anxieties, our own dreams. The loch becomes a screen, and the monster becomes cinema, not a being, but a story told through light, fear, memory, and hope. Psychologists have long noted the phenomenon. People see what they expect. And when standing before Loch Ness, expectation hangs thick as mist. A person might catch a wave, a log, a swimming deer, but the mind, primed by generations of narrative, reshapes the ordinary into the extraordinary. It is not deception. It is human nature. We are creatures of story, And we make monsters not to scare ourselves, but to remind ourselves that mystery still breathes. And there is something holy in that. Because what Nessie offers is not terror, but grace. She is a myth untainted by violence, a gentle specter who harms no one, who leaves no destruction, who simply exists at the edge of vision. Unlike so many monsters born of rage or blood, Nessie waits in silence. She asks nothing. She chases no one. Her power lies in her restraint. And in that restraint, she becomes sacred. Not because she is real, but because we wish she could be. The sacred does not need to be literal. It only needs to be meaningful.
Across cultures, lake monsters appear in similar forms. In Canada, there is Ogopogo. In Scandinavia, Storhjojuret. In the Congo, Mokalembembe. Each one tied to water, to depth, to places where the eye cannot follow. These are not isolated tales. They are echoes, evidence not of creatures, but of a shared human language. The water, always the water, dark, unknowable, vast. Our ancestors feared it. We still do, but we also revere it. And in its mirror-like surface, we cast our deepest archetypes. Nessie, then, is not alone. She is part of a chorus, a global hymn to the hidden. And every culture sings its own verse. But what unites them is the same pulse, the belief that not everything is ours to name, to dissect, to conquer. Some things must remain submerged, sacred, untouchable. In this way, the Loch Ness monster becomes a guardian of mystery. Her legend defends the last wild places in the imagination. And that may be her truest role, not as a beast of flesh and scale, but as a boundary keeper between the known and the unknowable, between the daylight world of science and the twilight world of myth. She swims the borderlands of mind and matter, a creature of in-betweens, of thresholds, not fully spirit, not fully beast, not wholly fiction, not wholly real. Like a dream remembered just after waking, Nessie belongs to the space where things blur, where categories collapse. And in that collapse, something ancient stirs. The awareness that our need for definition is not the same as truth. Loch Ness, with its cold black depths and shifting weather, becomes more than habitat. It becomes metaphor. The monster does not need to rise for us to feel her presence. She is already there in the mist that hides the far bank, in the sudden gust that ruffles the surface, in the way the air stills when the sun disappears behind a highland ridge. Her power is atmospheric, a change not in the water, but in perception, and perhaps that is where the legend draws its strength, not from sight, but from suggestion. Nessie is rarely seen, and when she is never seen clearly. She is an arc, a hump, a ripple, a form without form. The more we try to capture her, the more she eludes us. And this elusiveness is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. The Loch Ness monster is an idea that resists compression. She cannot be caught on film without ambiguity, without doubt. She slips through the lens and back into the collective subconscious, where her outline sharpens, paradoxically, in shadow. This is how all great myths survive, not by presenting themselves plainly, but by staying just out of reach. And so we pursue. But the pursuit is not about catching, it is about continuing, about keeping the corridor between reality and mystery open, about resisting the full enclosure of the world. And what happens when that corridor closes? We begin to shrink. We trade wonder for efficiency. We replace myth with mechanism. And soon the world becomes flat, mapped, scanned, labeled, but lifeless. This is why Nessie matters. She is resistance, not to science, but to finality. A reminder that wonder is not a childish thing to be outgrown, but a vital compass pointing toward parts of the soul untouched by data. It is no accident that she lives in water. Water, in nearly every culture, is a portal, a boundary between life and death, between this world and the other. Lakes, rivers, oceans, these are thresholds, entrances to the unknown. In mythology, they are always guarded by ferrymen, serpents, naiads, or monsters. Nessie is such a guardian. She does not block the threshold. She defines it. She reminds us where the edge is, and what lies beyond that edge. Not horror, not violence, but depth. A depth that cannot be quantified. A call to humility in the face of what we do not know. A return to listening instead of speaking. Watching instead of naming. Loch Ness does not speak. It reflects. And those who linger long enough on its shore begin to feel it. That stillness, that pressure, that sense that something is watching back. Not to harm, not even to answer, but simply to exist, unclaimed, unowned, and utterly free. This is the secret heart of every myth: freedom. Not the freedom to roam, but the freedom to resist definition. Nessie is not a prisoner of the loch. She is its sovereign. She moves not as a body, but as a presence, a question no taxonomy can answer. And perhaps that is why she endures, when other legends dissolve beneath the floodlights of explanation. She asks nothing. She explains nothing. She is only ever there, or not there. And in that not knowing, we are given space to breathe. But space like this is rare. Rarer still in a culture that insists everything be known, displayed, resolved. Loch Ness becomes a sanctuary, not just of nature but of imagination, a sacred refusal of finality. And Nessie, long reduced to cartoons and coffee mugs, quietly reclaims her power, not in appearance, but in disappearance. Each year that she is not found only deepens her presence. Yet there is a deeper irony, almost a hidden truth. The more we seek her, the further she slips. Because to look for Nessie as one would hunt a beast is to misunderstand what she is. She is not a biological anomaly. She is an anomaly of consciousness, a shimmer in the way humans perceive the wild, a fault line where the seen and the unseen crack apart, letting something ancient rise through the gap. The loch is only the setting. The real theater is the human soul, and that theater is shadowed by more than wonder. Because lurking behind the myth of Nessie is another story, the tale of how modernity rewrites the old world. For Loch Ness is not untouched wilderness. It is bordered by roads, towns, cameras. And as the legend spread, so too did its exploitation. The 20th century, in its hunger for spectacle, turned her mystery into marketing. She was printed, packaged, performed. Her silence sold in loud colors. But silence cannot be sold. It can only be entered. And so a divide formed between the Nessie of merchandise and the Nessie of mist, between the friendly mascot and the cold, ambiguous ripple in the water. The true Nessie, the one that makes the hair rise on the neck of an old fisherman at dusk, the one glimpsed just once and never forgotten, she waits beneath the caricature. She is not there for amusement. She is there to remind us that awe still has its place, and awe in its truest form humbles. It pulls us down into ourselves. It strips away ego and leaves only quiet, the same quiet that once filled the mouths of caves and temples, the same quiet that ancient peoples called sacred. To stand beside Loch Ness in stillness is to feel a trace of that ancient hush, the hush that precedes revelation or refusal.
Because not all mysteries yield their truths. Some are meant to remain veiled, precisely because they speak not to fact, but to faith. Faith not in dogma, but in wonder, in the possibility that the world still holds places where human understanding breaks down, where silence speaks louder than language, and where the unknown is not a threat, but a gift. Nessie is that gift, not to be unwrapped, but to be honored from afar. And yet, there have always been those who could not help but reach. The human impulse is not only to witness wonder, but to possess it, to name, to define, to drag it into the light and claim mastery. We do this not from malice, but from fear. Fear that what we do not understand might vanish. That mystery, if left unmeasured, will dissolve like breath on glass. And so we build museums. We gather artifacts. We catalog myths as though they were moths pinned to velvet. But Nessie defies the pin. Her power lies in evasion, and more than that, in transformation. Because the Nessie we speak of today is not the Nessie that once haunted the loch.
The Kelpie of ancient Gaelic tales was not a passive swimmer. It was a predator. It lured, deceived, and drowned. The water horse did not smile for cameras. It wore the face of your kin to draw you closer. It was dangerous, not in body, but in meaning. It was the shape fear took in a world where nature was not a backdrop, but a god. And this truth, this ancient root of the monster, is what the modern legend conceals. What if Nessie is not a creature at all, but a warning? A symbol passed from age to age, changing form but never purpose. The Kelpie became the serpent. The serpent became the plesiosaur. The plesiosaur became the hoax. And now the hoax becomes belief again, refined, questioned, but still intact. Each transformation is not a death, but a disguise. Because the essence remains unchanged, something waits in the deep. And what waits is always watching. To the ancient Highlanders, the loch was alive. It breathed, it remembered, and it punished. Water was never neutral. It could bless, but it could also claim. And monsters were not aberrations. They were laws, embodied boundaries. They told you how far you could go. They reminded you that the world had its own will. The myth of Nessie in this light is not a tale of curiosity, but of caution. A whisper that says, there are places not meant to be known. But we no longer speak that language. We have replaced it with terms like natural phenomenon and optical illusion. We have built a vocabulary that dissects wonder into digestible parts. And in doing so, we risk forgetting what the old myths once held sacred. The idea that the world does not exist for us alone. That the loch is not just a mirror of our obsessions, but a consciousness in its own right. What if Nessie is not merely myth, but mirror, reflecting not what is in the water, but what is in us? She appears when we need her. When our confidence in the world begins to crack, when our technologies become too loud, too sure. She rises not from the lake bed, but from the fault lines of certainty. From the tectonic tension between what we think we know and what we feel must still be possible. And perhaps this is her greatest illusion, that she is a monster of the deep, when in truth she is a monster of the mind, a guardian of our limits, a reminder that some boundaries must remain unbreached, that awe, to survive, must be honored from the shoreline. But how does awe survive in a world that does not wait? In a culture of constant motion, scrolling, streaming, uploading, where even the sacred must be captured, processed, turned into data. The old myths moved slowly. They needed seasons, silence, and stars. But Nessie now lives in the world of immediacy. Her name is a hashtag. Her legend is time-stamped. And yet, even here, she resists, because something ancient still stirs in the act of watching water. No matter how fast the world becomes, the loch does not rush. Its rhythm remains slow, tidal, lunar, and those who stand before it truly stand, without device, without lens, begin to feel it. The tension between surface and depth, the intuition that something larger, colder, more enduring than ourselves is present. Not looming, not threatening, but simply being. And being, in this case, is enough to provoke reverence. It is here, at this threshold between reverence and restlessness, that Nessie performs her most potent magic. She holds attention, not through spectacle, but through absence, through the possibility that something might appear, or might not. And in that liminal space, the watcher is transformed. They begin to listen. They begin to feel the weight of what they do not know. And the loch becomes more than scenery. It becomes scripture. Because all myths in the end are forms of scripture, not doctrines of fact, but living texts of meaning. They carry the emotional weather of a people, their fears, hopes, griefs, and longings. And Nessie, strange and solitary, carries a very particular longing. The ache for something beyond reach, something we can't monetize, decode, or command. A beauty that will not perform. And so she hides. And in hiding she reveals. She reveals the cracks in our certainty, the hollowness of our conquests, the emptiness that follows the end of wonder. We do not weep when monsters are slain. We weep when they are explained. Because in the explaining we lose part of ourselves, the part that knows how to kneel, how to marvel, how to let go of knowing. Nessie does not offer knowledge. She offers permission. Permission to not know. To not know is not to be ignorant. It is to be humble. And humility is in short supply. Especially in a world that believes it has mapped every inch, mastered every craft, modeled every outcome. But the loch is not a map. And Nessie is not a model. She is interruption. She is fracture. She is the pause in the breath of reason. And those who truly understand her do not ask, is she real? They ask, why do we still need her to be? Because needing her is the answer. We need something to wait for, something to imagine, something that remains when the screen goes dark. Nessie is that remnant, the last unsolved riddle in a world that prizes solutions. And so long as she waits beneath the water, we remain whole, not because we found her, but because we haven't. Because discovery is not always the goal. Sometimes the power of a thing lies in its elusiveness. The moment it is captured, pinned beneath the harsh light of certainty, it loses the very essence that made it sacred. Nessie's strength is not in evidence, but in endurance, not in her presence, but in her refusal to be claimed. Like the myths of old gods who vanish into mist or descend into oceans, she remains just out of reach, where memory becomes myth and myth becomes meaning. And in that refusal, she becomes more than a creature. She becomes a question. Not just what is in the water, but what remains in us? What remnants of wildness survive our constant taming of the world? What shards of awe remain unbroken beneath the weight of progress? Nessie is a relic, not of the prehistoric past, but of the emotional past, a time when nature still whispered to us in symbols, and the unseen held more truth than the measured. This is what modern science so often forgets, that truth is not always data. Truth can be intuitive, archetypal, emergent from silence rather than sound. The truth of Nessie is not in sonar blips or blurry photos.
It is in the way a child leans toward the water's edge, hoping. In the way an old man on a boat still glances over his shoulder at dusk. In the collective heartbeat that skips when something ripples without reason. These are not facts. They are feelings. And feelings have their own kind of truth. In ancient Celtic traditions, the lake was considered a threshold, a place where worlds touched, the living and the dead, the mortal and the divine. And creatures like Nessie were not outliers. They were expressions of the threshold itself. Liminal beings, born from the place between, not merely physical, but metaphysical, not bound by natural law, but governed by something older, the law of symbol. And symbols never truly vanish. They evolve, they migrate, they wear new faces but speak the same language. Nessie, in this light, becomes an avatar of the old Kelpies and water spirits. Yes, but also a modern archetype. The last honest mystery. The one story we keep retelling. Not to solve it, but to keep it alive. To remind ourselves that not every light must be turned on. That some rooms are meant to be entered in shadow. Because shadow has its own sacredness. It is in shadow that we dream, that we imagine, that we allow for the possibility of the impossible. The Loch Ness monster does not haunt us because she might be real. She haunts us because she might be necessary.
Necessary to balance our relentless pursuit of explanation. Necessary to hold the space where questions can still live without immediate answers. And perhaps this is why the sightings continue. Not despite the hoaxes, but because of them. Because the hoax does not kill the myth. It only reminds us that truth and fiction have always danced in the same fog. That every lie told in earnest, every faked photo, every staged ripple, speaks to a deeper truth. The human longing to believe. Not in monsters, but in meaning. Not in creatures, but in connection. Connection to something older, deeper. Hungrier for mystery than for knowledge. This hunger is ancient. It predates books and tools. It is the ache that drove us to paint on cave walls, to watch stars for signs, to carve gods from stone and beasts from wind. Before we sought to master nature, we sought to commune with it. And the monsters of our oldest stories, serpents, dragons, leviathans, were not invaders from elsewhere. They were expressions of the world's deep strangeness, its refusal to be simple. Nessie stands in that lineage, a descendant of sacred unknowables. She is not a cryptid in the modern sense, not a creature to be tracked like a lost bear or a misidentified whale. She is ritual, a reenactment of the very human act of peering into the dark and imagining a shape. That shape may shift over time, may borrow from science or cinema, but the act itself remains unchanged. We look into water and want to see something more than reflection. We want to see revelation. And this is where Nessie transcends even her own myth. Because she is not just the hope of discovery. She is the fear of extinction. Not of species, but of stories. Of silence. Of the wild spaces in the psyche where not everything has been named. As the world grows louder, faster, brighter, we lose not just places on the map, but places in the mind. Loch Ness is one of the last strongholds. A bastion of twilight. A sanctuary for what cannot be explained, only felt. That feeling, elusive, melancholic, profound, is the true body of the monster. It moves beneath our words, it ripples through generations, it flickers in folklore and resurfaces in the dreams of children who draw dinosaurs with gentle eyes and call them Nessie. It survives every debunking, every hoax, because it does not depend on facts. it depends on need. The human need for enchantment. But enchantment must be tended. And the danger now is not that we will find Nessie and prove her false. The danger is that we will stop looking altogether. That we will become so entranced by artificial wonders, so flooded by simulations, that we forget how to be still before a silent loch. That we lose our capacity to imagine something older than ourselves. Something that does not answer back. Something that simply waits. Because Nessie, if she exists in any true form, exists in that waiting. She is the pause between thoughts, the breath between questions. She is what we feel when we turn off the screen, stand at the water's edge, and let the fog roll in. And in that moment, we are not consumers or scientists or skeptics. We are pilgrims, not traveling to find, but to remember. To remember what it feels like not to know. That is the deeper magic of the monster, not her shape, but her silence. The space she opens in the human soul, the invitation she extends, to believe not because we must, but because we can. To hope not for proof, but for presence. And that presence, however fleeting, transforms. It turns tourists into seekers, turns doubt into awe, turns a quiet loch in the Highlands into the sacred center of a myth that will not die. Because we do not want it to die. Because somewhere, in the marrow of our being, we still yearn for something vast and wild to be real. That yearning is not childish. It is not naive. It is ancient. It is human. It pulses through myth and memory like blood through a vein. Invisible but vital. We long for wildness not because we wish to fear it, but because we once belonged to it. And Nessie, in her impossible grace, offers a flicker of reunion. Not with a creature, but with a forgotten part of ourselves. A part that remembers what it meant to be in relationship with mystery, not in dominion over it. There is a sacred humility in this remembering. Because Nessie reminds us of limits, not limitations of knowledge, but of dominion. She is not ours. She never was. She belongs to the loch, to the fog, to the timeless hush of myth. And in a world that seeks to monetize everything, her refusal to be caught becomes radical. It is not just an act of survival. It is an act of defiance, a silent resistance against the flattening of all things into content. She cannot be consumed. Only witnessed, and even then only briefly. And what is seen, if seen at all, is never clear. A ripple, a shadow, a shape that suggests but never confirms. This is her language, the language of threshold, the poetry of vagueness. She teaches us again what ancient mystics always knew, that the sacred does not shout, it whispers, and only those who wait in stillness, without demand, will hear. Yet that stillness is increasingly rare. We have been trained out of it, pulled into urgency, into screens, into noise. The slow rhythm of water, the language of lochs and forests, grows foreign. And so the legends retreat, not because they are false, but because we have forgotten how to receive them. Nessie becomes not just a myth in hiding, but a test, a spiritual gauge. Can we still sense what does not seek to prove itself? Can we still feel the presence of the unseen? Those who have encountered her, truly quietly, often speak not of excitement, but of reverence. They describe a hush, a moment when time bends, a stillness so thick it presses on the skin. The shape they saw may fade, may blur with years, but the feeling does not. Because what they encountered was not a monster, but the return of myth itself. Alive, breathing,
moving just below the surface of what is known. This, then, is the essence of Nessie. Not a fossil from another age, but a spirit of our age, an emblem of what resists disappearance. She lives because we need her to. She hides because the sacred must. And in the tension between appearance and absence, she teaches us the true nature of mystery. Not that it must be solved, but that it must be held. Held lightly, held with awe, held like a candle in the dark. And in that holding, we are changed. We remember the shape of stories not written, but lived. We feel again the pull of waters that do not answer back. And we step away from the edge, not disappointed but grateful, that something vast and wild remains beyond us, uncaught and uncapturable. That is her final magic. Not that she might be real, but that she refuses to be resolved. In every age, the unknown has taken a form, a shape suited to the era's fears, its hopes, its hidden truths. For some, it was the forest that watched. For others, it was the sky that beckoned. But for us, for the world grown too loud, too fast, too sure, it is the water that waits. And within it, Nessie, patient and ancient, reminds us of the myth we need most now, the one we cannot control. Because in trying to master everything, we have lost something essential. We have sterilized the sacred. We have built cities over bones, paved roads through memory, flooded valleys that once held gods. And in doing so, we have silenced the voices that once spoke through storm, stone, and stream. But Nessie's voice still lingers. Not loud, not demanding, but persistent, like a ripple that returns after the boat has passed. She is not here to convince. She is here to endure. And in that endurance lies the final inversion of her myth.
For all the cameras, sonar sweeps, documentaries, and doubters, she has not been debunked. Instead, she has grown stronger, stranger, deeper. Her power no longer depends on whether she is flesh or fable. Her power lies in being both. She is the liminal thing, the question that cannot be closed, the echo that refuses to fade. And what do we make of such a thing? We fear it sometimes. We mock it. We commercialize it. We turn it into toys and logos and internet jokes. But beneath all of that, behind the irony, behind the skepticism, we preserve it. Because some part of us knows when the last mystery is solved, something precious dies. Not in the world, but in us. So Nessie remains, not just in Scotland, but in the global subconscious. She has transcended place. She now swims through story, through every whispered hope that the world is still more than we understand, through every child's drawing of a smiling beast in blue water, through every adult who, standing at the shore, waits a little longer than they admit. And here, in this final turn, she becomes more than symbol. She becomes a paradox. She is the monster we invented, and the one that invented us. She is the fear of being alone in the universe, and the hope that we are not. She is the reminder that not everything that cannot be proven is false, and not everything that is unseen is gone. She holds open the door between what is and what might be. And in doing so, she saves us from ourselves. Because we are the ones who hunger to classify, to conquer, to consume. But we are also the ones who kneel at shrines, who whisper to the stars, who weep before beauty we cannot explain. Nessie is the bridge between these selves, the shadow on the loch that reminds us we are not meant to understand everything. Some truths are not found in discovery, but in devotion. Some mysteries are not puzzles, but prayers. And Nessie, whatever she is, whatever she isn't, remains our last great prayer to the unknown.
It is whispered not in cathedrals but at the edge of lakes, not in language but in longing. It rises in the silence after a question no one answers, a silence that doesn't seek a voice, but a presence. Nessie is that presence. She is not a confession of belief, but of need. The need to stand before something vaster than reason, to feel not small in fear, but small in reverence. To remember that being humbled is not the same as being diminished. And so we return to the loch, again and again. Not because we expect to see her, but because we want to. And in wanting, something ancient opens. Something that remembers the days before the world was split into known and unknown, real and unreal. The days when myth was not separate from truth, but woven through it like mist through pine. Nessie brings that memory back, as gently as a ripple on the water. No crash, no roar, just presence. She asks us for nothing, but in her silence, she gives us a choice. We can chase her into extinction, dissect her, mock her, strip her of wonder and mount her behind glass. Or we can let her be. We can allow her to remain what she always was, a sentinel of mystery, a steward of the sacred unknown. Not because she demands protection, but because we need to protect the part of ourselves that still listens for her. Because when we let mystery die, we begin to die with it. Not in body, but in spirit. The part of us that dreams, that imagines, that opens its eyes to the dark and says, "There is more." That part must be kept alive. Not with proof, but with patience. Not with answers, but with awe. And in that way, Nessie lives. Not at the bottom of a lake, but in the depths of the human soul. She swims there, quietly, unnamed, uncaught, unforgotten. And if one day she is never seen again, if the cameras cease, if the stories fade, still, she will not vanish. Because what she represents cannot vanish. The hunger for meaning, the thirst for the sacred.
The wild hope that even now, something beautiful and unknowable might be watching us from the shadows, not to harm, but to remind. Remind us that we are not alone and never were. The Loch Ness monster was never about the monster. She was always about the loch, the stillness, the not knowing, the permission to believe. Thank you for walking with me along the mist-covered shores of Loch Ness, and for allowing this myth to unfold once more in the space between your thoughts. My hope is that we continue to honor these stories not as relics, but as living companions on the journey through mystery. If this tale has stirred something quiet and deep within you, I invite you to stay close for the next descent into forgotten lore. Until then, keep watching the water.